Netflix series You is very intriguing. Season 3. I'm speaking of Season 3. Again, let me explain. So, I watched it, and I also watched the other two, and I liked the first one. I liked the second one, and I also very much liked the third one. And I don't exactly know why. And I think it's something you also probably should watch, but nevertheless, let's try to explain why this is. So first of all, we try to get into the series, what is actually happening in the series, and in particular in Season 3, what is happening in Season 3. Then we try to get into how actually the series is structured, and also not only structured, but we take a look into the storytelling, what it actually is that intrigues us so much, and then we take a look into the deep dive psychology, maybe a little bit behind. So first of all, what is Season 3 about? So Season 1 was basically this. Joe Goldberg has a bookstore, and there he gets to know a girl, and then he basically stalks this girl and falls in love with this girl. Eventually, what happens with her, I cannot remember anymore. But the big reveal, obviously, is that Joe Goldberg is a serial killer, and he has kind of this box in the basement of his bookstore where he keeps people before sometimes he kills them. The thing is, he just gets himself into situations where the eventual death of the person seems always to be the only way out, because otherwise his cover would not be good enough anymore, and he would have to move, or he would have to go to prison, because the more and more he gets into these situations, and the more and more he gets into situations where he actually murders people again and again, the more obviously being exposed is a problem for him. So now Season 2 actually is the same plot kind of all over again. It's just with a different girl, and it's with a different girl, but also in the first two seasons there are like two girls, and in the third season there's actually Love. So Love is actually another girl he actually gets to know, and Love is someone who he wants to kill at the end of Season 2, but turns out she's pregnant. So therefore Season 3 now picks up when they basically move out into the suburbs and try to raise their child together. The thing is just that Love is actually the name of the girl, is also a serial killer. Not so serious as Joe, because she probably hasn't killed that many people, but as we later find out, so basically, this is a spoiler, because I'm talking about the series and I don't want to talk about it spoiler-free. So therefore, Love actually, as we find out in Season 3, also killed her previous husband. And now, they have this child called Henry, I think, and both of them are serial killers, and also Joe has this problem that he kind of stalks people. And he doesn't really stalk people because of nothing, but he stalks people because he finds these people very interesting. And one of these new persons is the neighbor. This is where all things take off. So, first of all, we have the neighbor, a very attractive mother, and then Joe stalks her again. Not really. He doesn't stalk her that much, I actually think, compared to the other movies, actually. And what happens is that they don't really fall in love, but as soon as Love finds out, she kills the other person. Her name is Angela, I think. So now, there's this problem that all of the families they got to know, because they did a little bit of networking, all of these families, they're in between all of these people they interacted with every single day. So what happens then is that they get deeper and deeper into these things, and they kill another person and another person and another person, sometimes together, sometimes alone. And Joe again meets someone else. The someone else is actually a librarian. He's basically his boss at a library. So now, and so what is the end? The end of it all is when what actually happens in the end. Yeah, so Love finds out about this new other love, and Joe actually wants to split, even though they have a child. So basically, it's about parenting, and they both wanna try to keep their past and also their urges, not the urges to kill people, because they kill people whenever. Yeah, well, Joe, I think, is much more nuanced and much more thoughtful in deciding who to kill, and the love is kind of spontaneous because she just kills whenever there's a situation she cannot get out otherwise. So now, in the end, Love finds out about his new affair, and so Joe's new affair, and Love actually wants to kill him, but instead Joe actually has foreseen it all, basically, and in the last minute reverses basically this attempt from Love and kills Love. So that's the end of the story, and Joe burns down the house and leaves, and everyone thinks now that basically both died, and it turns out that both were the serious killers, and that's the end of the story. So Joe moves out again, and he has survived, and Love is dead, and Henry, the actual child of those, is given to another couple. So now, this was the first part. This was basically the plot. So let's now take a look into storytelling. What is storytelling? It's basically trying to tell a story as good as possible and as interesting as possible. And when it comes to storytelling, there are many different things someone as a filmmaker can use. And one of these tools that is very frequently used, and that's kind of a special thing that this series has, is the narration, the voiceover by Joe Goldberg. And I think that, for one of the most important things in all of the series, apart from the obvious content of the thoughts and the content of the voiceover, just this tool as storytelling. Basically, the voiceover is, or are, Joe's inner thoughts. And Joe actually, so not the actual Joe, but the actor who plays Joe, Penn Badgley, actually says in an interview that 75 or even more % of his actual dialogue is just a voiceover. So he doesn't have that much dialogue because we just see Joe all the time and he interacts with his world and we just get to know his inner thoughts. And this is something that's just so very interesting. So there are kind of two different approaches to movie making, very simplified. The first one is, or also to storytelling in general. When we take a look at books, for example, when we take a look at Harry Potter, we never really get to know what Harry Potter's inner thoughts are because it actually is just described. So there's basically someone who is behind the curtain and who takes us on this journey, on this story. And this someone behind the curtain is the narrator. And in the series You, Joe is also the narrator. And this, I think, makes it so special because Joe, we kind of, apart from the fact that Joe is a serial killer, we kind of emphasize so much with Joe. And this is kind of strange because, I mean, this is obviously due to a lot of different psychological effects, which we will dive in later on. But just the fact that we sympathize so much with Joe Goldberg, even though he kills people, is kind of speaking for itself. For this fact speaks for itself and speaks for the quality of the storytelling in You. So actually, there is, I mean, the things that are happening are kind of interesting, but I mean, these are things that are kind of normal, I would guess. They are obviously not as normal as everyday life, but they are normal in terms of a normal story, you could say. So basically, these two, apart from all of the killing, the thing is that the killing is the thing that gives everything an edge, because it's basically, because if Joe has killed someone in the past, then from this point in time on, till the end of Joe's story, there will always be the fear that Joe will actually be discovered, that his cover is not there anymore and he will be exposed. And that's basically, so when it comes to storytelling and when it comes to also other things in life, using time constraints is something that is very helpful in order to focus on things, but also in order to focus on things to make it interesting. If you take a look at Mission Impossible, for example, Mission Impossible 7, I think, was the last one, they set things up. And then it's always a little bit too difficult because they basically cannot do it. But if all things work out very nicely, they could it's just a slight chance that it could happen. And the next thing is then they often add a time constraint. This means we have to, basically, if there is a bomb, for example, and you have to make sure the bomb doesn't go off, or for example in Batman also, the same thing. There is always a time constraint. There is a ticking bomb. And this ticking bomb principle is called basically a time constraint. And it's kind of very similar to, it's a similar principle. And the similar principle is that we, from the point on where someone does actually something that is not right, and from this point in time on till the end of the story, we have the time constraint, or rather, not the time constraint, but the fear that all of this could be exposed, that Joe could be exposed, that love could be exposed, and that all of the world, all of his faults, not really all of his faults, but the world they built for themselves, and also Joe built for himself, is about to crumble. And this thing, constantly, is something that makes everything more interesting, because at every single point in time, there is this risk. This is also kind of similar to the imposter syndrome, where people actually don't really think they fit into something. So they think they are imposters, for example. If Bill Gates, for example, was the CEO of Microsoft, and but in his mind, he still thinks he is he's basically not the right owner, or he's not the right one, and he doesn't even belong here, and he is far too not good for basically this position. This is kind of called the imposter effect. So basically, the imposter effect, what I'm trying to say with this is that there is also this fear of constantly being discovered, this fear of constantly being exposed. And this is something that is there in all of Joe Goldberg's life, basically. And this, I think, is one principle that makes it very interesting. Now let's take a closer look into the narration, and also into why the series in general is so interesting. At least to me, I don't know. I cannot speak for everybody else, but at least in the last interview Joe or Penn Badgley gave, they were kind of, I think it was season 3, and they were on the top of the Netflix charts. So now, there are two different things I want to discuss, and we are already kind of sliding into the third big point of this video, the psychological side. So, back to the two things now I want to discuss. The first thing is the voiceover, the narration, and the other thing, and I think it goes line in line with the other thing, which is the fact that Joe Goldberg is very attractive. So, what happens if someone is very attractive is something called the halo effect. And this can also happen with other things. If somebody has very much money, if somebody has any characteristic that basically stands out. If this one characteristic, or characteristic, I think, of this individual stands out, then this one thing can basically override our perception of a person in other areas as well. This could mean that if somebody is very attractive, then they have better chances in life in general. So basically, if they are in a store and they actually steal something, then and they get caught, a more attractive person is more likely to get out without being in prison or without getting punished for this thing. And so basically, the attractive halo, the physical attractive halo, is one of the most important ones, I think, but there are obviously also other ones. If you are very intelligent, for example, this stands out and kind of overrides the perception of people in all the other areas as well. This could mean if somebody's very intelligent and he doesn't even know how to talk properly, I mean, here's the thing kind of behind this. If, for example, somebody is very intelligent, chances are this person also can talk very nicely. So therefore, this correlation and also the halo effect is kind of based on real things. This means whenever somebody has a very positive characteristic that is very positive, then it also kind of makes sense sometimes to override also the perception of these other areas as well. But obviously, the effect is just there, so the effect is everything that is above the actual true perception. So yeah, well, that's basically the halo effect. And what is happening with Joe Goldberg is, and also with love, and also in movies in general. Why do we like movies so much? I mean, this is a not a holy, but a whole different story. But one aspect, at least, is the fact that actors are indeed above average attractive. And if somebody is above average attractive, combined with the fact that we like to watch people do things, watch people do interesting things, if we combine those two things, then we have the statement that we like attractive people do interesting things. And the more attractive or the more interesting these things are, so the more attractive the people or the more interesting the things they do, basically the story is, the more interesting we think all of this combined is. So when it comes to, for example, judging whether someone is a serial killer and whether somebody deserves to be punished, just trying to figure out if this is applicable to a person. When it comes to these things, what is happening, the more attractive a person is, the less likely we are to judge them or to negatively judge their actions. And this is happening with Joe Goldberg. Because, I mean, just stop this sentence I did before. Fact of the matter is, if we see somebody on screen, then at least in historic terms, these people tend to be above average attractive. And when you then cast someone who is a serial killer, but at the same time you need to make the audience empathize with this person, then casting someone who is even more above average attractive or just above average attractive is something that is useful, because then the story works better. Because if you found Joe to be an asshole, or if you've just found him to be not very likable, then you have the problem that you don't like the main character of the story. And if you don't like the main character of the story, then the problem is at some point in time you will be like, oh yeah, I mean, I don't like what this person is doing. And liking is not used here, or I didn't use it in a sense where you are like, oh, I like the things Joe does, but much more liking as so you could say if someone liked the series, for example, even though there happen horrifying things like in the horror genre, for example, that still people like the series because they watch the series still. And it kind of is similar to Joe Goldberg, even though Joe Goldberg as a person, as a character, is also kind of likable. There are also other principles storytellers use, and here is one of these to make Joe Goldberg even more likable. It's kind of this. I mean, the things he does in all of the 3 seasons are obviously not something you should do, and if everybody did these things, then we didn't live in a society where actually you wouldn't get stabbed in the back just for doing something. So now the thing is this. If we now want to have somebody who does these things, apart from the fact that also we can use the halo effect to make him more likable, what we also can use, or what storytellers also can use, is a save the cat moment. So when it comes to how to make somebody likable, there is kind of this theory coined by Blake Snyder, a kind of screenwriter who also wrote a book about screenwriting. What is a save the cat moment? It's basically a moment where the main character saves a cat in the beginning of the movie. So this is the literal moment. But let's take a deeper look into the principle behind this. So if someone saves a cat, this basically means that he cares about other things than himself, and he also cares about very lovely things, because cats are, for us, most of the time very lovely. This means if someone empathizes with somebody else or with something else that is again very lovely, then this kind of backfires onto the person itself. This means if Joe Goldberg, for example, in season 1 actually helps the neighbor's kid, or is in general just very nice as a person whenever he doesn't kill people, this still means that we like him as a person, because again, this is kind of this one thing overrides kind of the general perception and the general judging of all the actions of this character, Joe Goldberg. So in season 3, the best example is obviously his kid. His kid, or his toddler, called Henry, because he just has this bigger goal, and it doesn't really matter if he does all these things when he at the same time has this higher goal of protecting Henry and trying to make this family work for Henry. So with Henry, we basically have a save the cat moment all day long, because it's a toddler and we are by evolution kind of designed to protect these people called toddlers, these very young humans, and therefore also with cats it's similar. This is also the reason, so there are different effects playing into this, but for example, the proportions in toddlers and also just in very young specimens of a population in general, or of a specimen of a species, are in general kind of different from the proportions we have, for example, as adult humans. This means the eyes, in proportion to the head, for example, are bigger, and things like these. So all these principles, all these effects also kind of play into this constant save the cat moment we also have, because Henry is now a child Joe Goldberg protects. So we are already basically in the third point of what makes us like the whole series and what makes all of the series so interesting. So now we have the attractiveness halo, also when it comes to love, but we don't know that much about love because we still only have Joe's perspective. And Joe, it's basically Joe's story. It could be that the story is completely different from what we actually experience it, because Joe, obviously, is the only one that is there and tells us the story. I mean, but that's also not totally true. I mean, Joe is there, but at the same time, we kind of see things Joe doesn't. This means whenever we see something else happening, for example, when it comes to love, when she ever does something, Joe doesn't know. This means there is a narration, and this narration is basically the movie itself, because the two ways I previously stated, you can basically tell a story is, for one, by narrating it directly, but the other thing is just by showing things. The other method is just by showing things. This means it's basically just not being a narration on its own, but because we already watch things in real life and then figure things out on our own, because we try to make sense of all these things that happen and we can perceive. This means whenever we take a look at something, like a movie, and we see somebody act, then we automatically think, what is this person doing? And oh yeah, obviously he's making pancakes because he just gets all these things together, and then... So, by editing and by just showing what people are doing and also letting them speak, we also can think of a story. So a story, also if someone tells us a story, so again, the second method, it's not necessarily that if someone tells us a story that we take it word for word as true, but we still have our own mind. So basically the narration is just a layer before we make up our own mind about the story. When it comes to the series, we basically have the layer of the events that happen, shown in basically small clips, obviously added together as a season or a series, but then we have the voiceover, the narration of Joe's perspective. So whenever we see Joe, we get him we either can observe his actions and his interactions, or additionally, we also have his thoughts. So this is basically another layer behind it. And then all of this together, obviously, is all of it we can perceive, and then we make up our own story, our own interpretation. So now, let's get into the voiceover. Apart from the halo effect, Joe Goldberg's physical presence on screen has, we also have a different halo effect, kind of. It's not really called a halo effect, but it also could be a halo effect of a person if this person has a very positive, is basically above average in terms of the quality of this characteristic. And this characteristic is Joe's voice. Apart from the fact how... So, there are two things now again, when it comes to the voiceover itself. It's the content, and it's also kind of the method, or you could say, just how the information is actually transmitted to us. And this information transmission can make a huge difference. It's the same when, let's take a random quote. For example, time is money. I think it was Benjamin Franklin that stated this quote or coined this phrase. If at the same time, for example, a homeless person did the same thing, then it just would have a very different association. Because, so again, let's say a homeless person stands in line for food or something, and he says, "Yes, we can," just like Barack Obama, the same exact style. It has a very different association than compared to Barack Obama. And this thing, so basically, words, what I'm saying is this. The content of the words, so what actually is said, is sometimes, or there is also another factor, let's put it like this. There is also another factor that plays a huge role when it comes to transmitting information, apart from the information itself. And apart from so when it comes to speech, for example, the information itself can be kind of brought down to text, but text is only one part of all of the information transmission. And the other parts are the physical presence of the speaker, and also the voice of the speaker. And there are also many other factors, but let's just, for now, focus on the voice. Penn Badgley, the actor who plays Joe Goldberg, has a very nice voice. Apart from the fact that he also does different things to make it sound even better, the voice itself could be a reason for people to actually watch the series. And if not the only reason, it for sure plays a huge role, I would say, in how people perceive the show. I actually watched another series called Lupin or Arsène Lupin. I don't know if it's pronounced French or what's the correct pronunciation of Arsène Lupin. Nevertheless, the character in Arsène Lupin, who is played by Omar Sy, is also kind of narrating. But nevertheless, it sounds just very different. So when it comes to the perception of something, and in particular someone, the voice plays a very huge role. And there are a few principles that apply. For example, the deeper the voice, the more positive we actually, and the more, so there are different positive associations we have whenever we hear someone speak in a very nice voice, in basically a movie trailer speaking voice, like the voice you probably already know from all of the old trailers. In a world full of... This was not very good, but nevertheless, you know in which direction I am going. So there are different things that are working kind of behind the scenes. First of all, there is the rule of Menabrea. I actually found this thing a few years ago, and it's just an approximation. It's just like a rule of thumb, I guess. And the rule of thumb says that 30 to 40% of the perception of what actually someone is saying is the voice itself. So this means the better the voice itself, the more positive we just see all these things. This can mean that we empathize with a serial killer. This can mean that if someone like who is there someone out there who has a very dominant voice? Yeah, basically everyone you see on the radio, or the classical. I don't want to say classical, but let's just get back to the series. Joe Goldberg, or Penn Badgley, figured out, even though not having a really deep voice, I would say, he figured out how to speak in a voice that is very nice to sound. And also, it's just very nicely recorded. So therefore, this gives us basically a narration that makes us believe more in Joe Goldberg as a character, but also in the things he says because of his voice. So here are a few principles. if I talk about all of these things and I just don't name any principles you can or methods that are used, then I don't think it makes that much sense. For example, let's take a look at how I am recording this. And I think actually this is very similar to the setup they would be using if they recorded things like these. So first of all, you just record it very high quality. That makes a huge difference. Second of all, you try to go as close to the mic as possible without actually hitting the threshold where it's just too loud and then it cracks. So basically the audio kind of hits the ceiling and then it just doesn't sound very nice. The audio clips basically. So this is whenever the sound is just gone. Now you can do a few different things. So first of all, the lower you speak, and this is actually kind of proven scientifically, at least kind of, so there have been studies. Example, there was a startup called Theranos, and Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of the startup, actually spoke in a deeper voice whenever she interacted with people. And why did she do this? Because there were studies that said the more you approximate this ideal voice, the better it is, and the more authoritative you are seen, and the more likely it is that you, for example, get funds for your startup compared to if you just spoke with your normal female voice. This is kind of sad for all the females on this planet, but nevertheless, there are a few principles you still can apply. So first of all, the lower the voice, kind of the better. It's also just very simplified. Nevertheless, I want to give you something you actually can I just want to say something right now, and something that is also kind of true, and therefore I just say these things because they are simplifications, obviously, and the ideal of a voice is not like the lowest voice ever, because then that's also just a distraction. So basically, there is an optimal point in all of these different variables, and this optimal point is obviously not always the best or the most. So the highest voice or the lowest voice, but it's somewhere in between. Example, if you just go very, very low, then you go into basically infrasound. And infrasound is, for example, the thing elephants do whenever they... So basically, you can hear elephants. You could hear them, but we as humans don't hear them whenever they stomp on the ground because we just don't hear it. Therefore, just saying there is a limitation. It's not like, oh, it's best to have the lowest voice possible, which is something that in the comments of videos like these is like, oh yeah, so it's best to have the deepest voice? No, but it's a simplification. So the deeper the voice, the better. And this is something you can kind of train. And Joe Goldberg or Penn Badgley actually have trained their voice. Very similar to how I would do it if I now would focus more on my voice, which I am not because I haven't spoken English for a few days, and therefore I'm not as good in, and I have to concentrate more on what I actually am saying compared to how I actually say it. So the deeper the voice, the better. Then the next principle is straw bass. What is straw bass? It's basically this sound. And if you hit the right spot in your throat, then you actually can just make the sound, but even better. I just tried a few more times because I haven't tried it in a few days. You can do the sound when inhaling or when exhaling. So, so now the next step is to combine your normal speaking voice, or the best voice you can possibly do, with the sound. And what happens then is, I just try to show you how this all comes together. So first of all, try to make your voice as low as possible. This is not a how to sound the most trailer voice possible guide, but nevertheless, I think it's a major variable why this series is actually so interesting, and is actually also liked and viewed so many times, and so very much. So now, let's first of all try to speak as low as possible. A very nice principle you can do, or a very nice method, is just try it out for yourself if you are interested in the voice so much. Given that you are interested in making your own voice sound more like Joe Goldberg, is this. You just scream or shout into your arm. So this would basically be like, you can obviously try to keep the sound in your body because you don't want to scream. But what happens then is if you do this for 10 seconds, your voice is worked out. It's kind of simulates having spoken a lot. So what happens then is that you just sound more hoarse. It's not that you sound more like a horse, but you sound more hoarse. This is also why when people have colds, for example, they just sound better, and it's like, oh yeah, these nice voices. It's similar to the morning voice. The morning voice is actually kind of a phenomenon, I think, at least now, not having read studies about the morning voice, but nevertheless, if you breathe through your mouth, for example, all through the night, and if you don't close your mouth, what happens is that your throat kind of gets sore overnight, and this is kind of similar to having spoken a lot. This is why the morning voice will sound similar to this we're actually doing. And you can simulate this by just screaming or shouting for a few seconds. This is the first thing you can do to sound more like Joe Goldberg. The next thing is now to try to speak with the lowest voice possible. The next thing is you try to combine the speaker voice with this straw bass. It basically sounds like, so you basically do the sound all the time, and then you just speak in between. It sounds a little bit like a preacher. For example, if I had a dream. I just cannot do it very nicely now because my voice isn't trained as good as it sometimes is because I haven't recorded for so many minutes before. Nevertheless, what you actually can do now, as a fourth principle, you just move closer to the mic, and you also get something like this, because this allows you to get closer to the mic without hitting the ceiling of the audio. So this means now you can basically do an audio that sounds a little bit more like Joe Goldberg. And if you do an audio that sounds more like Joe Goldberg, what this means is that people who watch this series will just be more intrigued by it. So, therefore, as a final thought to why the series sounds, or just summing it up, I don't want to be this video to hit like 2 hours. Nevertheless, let's just try to sum it up again. First of all, Joe Goldberg, or Penn Badgley, is very attractive. This is due to many different things, but what the storytellers and also Hollywood in general tends to use, or every other, it's not only Hollywood, it's also in every magazine you see, you just tend to see people that look better, because the better someone looks, the better his halo, basically. His looks, halo, and better, the more interesting these things they say or the things they do are. Or are at least perceived. So this is the first big principle. Casting someone that is very attractive. The next principle is... The next important thing is the storytelling. So using different principles, for example, like using a save the cat moment, like in season 3, for all of the time, basically with Henry. So protecting someone that is smaller than ourselves, and also just caring for somebody else. So basically also caring for something that is bigger than ourselves, and also at the same time having a goal that is not like... Having a goal basically influences the choices characters make. And if we then at the same time know what the end goal is, for example, protecting the family, or Henry by all means, then we kind of understand better what the individual actions are doing. There is also something else to discuss, theoretically, which is called a passive character versus an active character. What are the differences? Passive characters things just happen to them and they just react, whereas active characters make choices. You could make a whole motivation speech out of this, I guess. Nevertheless, this is also something the series is very good at, because they actively make choices, for example, by killing the people or by protecting someone, and we also are involved very much in the thought process behind at least Joe's choices. Then we have this voiceover, which basically gives us access to the inner thoughts of Joe Goldberg, and at the same time we have Joe Goldberg's halo voice, because Joe Goldberg or Penn Badgley have a very nice voice. Therefore, we also have the halo of this voice, which is also influencing us subconsciously all the time. And this, apart from the storyline, obviously, because I didn't discuss the storyline itself, but rather the principles that are applied to making the story interesting. All of these things combined are just variables that I think make the series called You more interesting.